now setting it up. Hopefully Michelle will come literally as we're talking. Become like, that fabulous entrance we were all waiting for. We thought Kazim was going to be that fabulous entrance, and it was being someone else. All right. Let us see. Yeah, it says we're in live now, right? Let me just advise her.
Are you going to your own page or to the Sambashana page this time?
Sambashana page. I know I made that mistake, but this time I was very careful about it. Yeah, it's saying yes, and we have 3 people watching as well.
Excellent.
Better than 0.
Well, hello everyone, and who's watching? We are currently waiting on Michelle because life and running late. Your own page or to Sambashana. Oh gosh, whoever's listening to it on sound, please turn it off because it's gonna echo and I'm gonna get really distracted by the sound of my own voice.
So thank you everyone. We're really happy to have you. We will see Michelle shortly, but we also have the lovely Kazim, and that is also a sign for celebration because we love having Kazim as well. It'll become maybe a little bit. So yeah,
good to be here with you.
Good to have you. We're so excited. What made you decide that you wanted to appear on Sambashana of all places?
Well, I mean, I think it's exciting that we're talking from around the world, isn't it? I mean, 2 of us are in Australia, right? And then you're in Texas, I'm in California, where we are more or less circling the planet. So yeah. Exciting.
And then we're all connected back to the South Asian homeland.
It is a global diaspora.
Oh, there's Michelle. Now she's come. And it is. It's one of the things that fascinates me and was why I wanted to start something like this. And I'm really happy that you are. Hello, Michelle. Nice to see you. We happen to be live right now, but we've had to start already. But we're very happy. I mean, now actually this works in very well because then I can go ahead and kind of introduce. I mean, Kazim and Michelle Cahill are 2 of the most interesting poets working right now. And I think that one thing that's really interesting about you 2 is the way that you channel like a certain style of South Asianness in your poetry that isn't necessarily like a textual, like I'm going to write about being brown in the US, I'm going to write about my heritage, but more the way that these kinds of styles and structures kind of can affect things on a stylistic level, on a structural level, on a poetic level, on a sound level. I mean, I can go on and on about some of you and what you've written, but I mean, my point is that I really appreciate the way that this mix and this kind of desire to spread culture in what is normally considered a Western canon is really natural and organic and is really beautifully done. So I'm really happy to have both of you here.
Thank you for having us. And Michelle, it's really great to meet you.
It's lovely to meet you too, Kazim, and I've really enjoyed hearing some of the poems that you've written, which you did put online in the videos. I really enjoyed it so much. It's lovely to meet you. Yeah, and yeah.
So, Michelle, Kazim, tell us a little bit about kind of the work you do and how you got into poetry in a way as your primary source of being an artist. Kazim, I'll start with you.
Well, I was just talking about this with somebody, and it's hard to really say how I began in poetry because I feel like I think less than choosing poetry, I think poetry chose me. I think it's an incredibly difficult form. I think that there are other ways of writing that actually could probably get a larger audience. I have a memoir that's coming out in March, and far more people are already interested in that book than have ever been interested in any poetry that I do. I mean, it's a pure art form. It's beloved to me, but it certainly has a smaller audience than other kinds of writing. For me, there was never a choice. I mean, I think from the beginning, I was entranced by poetry's possibilities. I was, enamored of the ways that, one can create meaning in a poem that seems impossible to do in any other kind of language. So I think I was, in a way, I'm stuck with it, but I feel very lucky. And I would choose no other life for myself.
Yeah, I think that's something very clear. I mean, when I read your work and when I hear your work, because your work is just as important as it sounds, I think, on the page, you can tell that this is something that you really had to do. And that I don't think, even though I've read also your prose, I think that really your poetry is where you shine because of that mastery of image and sound and
it's the origin point for me, even with every other thing that any project that I have, whether it's prose or not, excluding some of the journalism that I've done, which is like, that's a separate thing. But other than that, I always start from the poem. So whether I'm writing fiction or writing an essay, my book about fasting they're blogs, but I think the logic of poetry and the structure of poetry was always foremost for me, no matter what.
That's interesting. I do want to get to Michelle, but I actually find it a really interesting idea and something that could be useful from a craft level. So like when you are starting like a work of say prose or fiction, like how is it that you approach it first as a poem and then expand it? Can you go a little bit more into that process?
I think it's at the level of language and the level of image also, but at some point it turns into the logic that from which one sentence moves to another, or how a thought is constructed in writing. And I think when one is writing prose, one really thinks about making meaning. One wants to write beautiful prose, but I think that one thinks about making meaning first. But when one is writing poetry, I don't think one is thinking about making meaning first. I think one is thinking about language and the beauty of language and the form and the structure and where that might lead one. So in a sense, I think a poet is always feeling his way forward in the dark. A true poet.
Yeah, that's an interesting thought. And I do want Michelle to give a proper introduction to why she came to poetry, but I think that also is a good segue for Michelle to reflect on her process as well, because she's also writing between poetry and fiction. So would you like to weigh in on that kind of space in which one starts language, Michelle?
Yeah, of course. So much to think about there. I agree with Kazim about poetry being less concerned with semantics, with meaning, and in some ways I find it a more abstract form. So it has a lot of possibilities. In many ways it has a lot more possibilities than fiction, because it's not as reliant on structure. It has the plasticity to be able to sort of like do more gymnastics, and so as far as why I came to poetry, to be honest, actually it's hard to say, but I think when I was growing up, I remember one of the earliest pieces of writing that I did do were poems in school. One was about a cat and just watching the cat moving in the garden, and I kind of learned in my own way that way without really having any formal education about poetry at all. I was learning about what an image is and the power of observation and just, putting it to paper. There was also another poem I wrote about the sadness I felt about living in a city and the way that nature has, in a way, been neglected. I mean, it was quite sort of simple but yet it still resonates a lot with the work that I've done and continue to be inspired by, want to feel concerned about, our environment. So it's interesting. It's almost like a lot of what I actually believe in now and in much more sophisticated ways now were kind of in that very early poem, like it was a real sadness about, why human beings doing this. And I think I illustrated it with, buildings and smoke and cars and fumes and sort of so and it sort of, it had a real existential feel to it. I think the last line was something like, the web of life will surely snap, you know, and it was really what I felt, you know, deep down, and I still feel that we have to preserve nature, we have to connect with nature, that we have to stop thinking we're better than nature, that we're better than animals, because we're just another animal, and there's no sort of hierarchy there. So I think it's interesting that was one of the poems that I wrote when I was young, I mean in primary school. And so then, but in my early years, sort of in my 20s or late teens, it was prose that I was really kind of transfixed by, and I read fiction and I wrote fiction. I love prose and I love fiction, and it was very hard to get published. So at that point in time, it was suggested to me, look, write poetry, because you can get a book published. You can sort of start out getting poems published in journals, and then, you know, you can build up to a collection. And that's kind of what I did. But always I was trying to get my poems published. I think, however, that if you're writing in a non-mainstream way, if you're writing in ways which are pushing language, it doesn't matter who you are. I don't really think it's about identity. I actually think it's more a question of genre. I think that you know, it really doesn't matter who you are. It's just very difficult to get that picked up by publishers. And so I think really, when I look back, it's been something that poetry has been there as I've been exploring language and exploring how I can bring that into the longer form. I don't really see it as a divide, but it is a divide. It's definitely, there is a different voice that speaks to me when I sit down to write a poem. There's a particular voice that I wait to hear, and there's a particular space that I clear in my mind, or I try to clear. It's not always clear. But you kind of know you're writing a poem, and it's not you know, it's not even a short fiction, a flash fiction. You definitely know that this is a poem. And there's also something rather beautiful and important to me about that particular space that is created when you, because it's like I know this sounds a little bit precious, but it's almost like a calling. It's like you're being called to sit down and write that poem. And what you should do as a writer is serve that, right? You should serve that calling. You should just sit down and honor that and put everything aside and give it your focus, and then, you know, just see it out to the end as well as you can. And sometimes it doesn't come out that well because for other reasons, maybe you've been a bit too hasty with it. It always comes out better when you just wait for the calling, I find, you know. So I find for myself, when I'm in the right environment, then I don't have to push as much, and then the calling will come and I'll know, okay, I'll have to put my prose aside now. It's time to write a poem. And that's a very special thing for me. I know that I am a poet, even though I write prose, and even though I've just been finishing a novel. And I also, a novel is an enormous task. It's been utterly exhausting. I can't even describe it. I don't even know how I've done it. However, it's a small ambition, but I do hope one day that I'll write another novel because it's an amazing journey. It's an amazing thing to finish, and it's an achievement. So I do hope that there'll be an opportunity for me, for things to be right in my life, that I can write another novel in future. But that's how I go. I just go with language, and you know, different part. When I'm going into different modes, it's poetry, it's time to write a poem, it's okay, then it'll be in future time to put that together as a book or something, you know.
Yeah, I think it's a fascinating, I mean, you said so many things, Michelle, and a lot of them I was like, I really want to like delve into that one point, then you went to another, because there was a lot of depth in a lot of those points, and I don't know which one I'm going to, start with. I think first I'll just say, I really find the idea of that city, the fear of the city and the decay, this kind of inevitable loss of the environment, and as we as humans expand, we often take advantage of other beings and species and even ourselves. And I sometimes also wonder if it's just inevitability that we are just built on the consumption of not only things, but people and experiences as well. And it's just part of our human nature that we consume in order to make sense of ourselves. And it's a very hard process to change. I do want to give Kazim a second to reflect. Like, is there anything, Kazim, that being also someone who's a very much of a renowned poet, do you have anything that you would like to respond to what Michelle said, or something you'd like to jump into?
I think it's true that I think being a poet has spoiled me in a certain way. I never really felt as a writer too bound by needing to create something that an audience would respond to, because the audience for poetry is so small. Beloved of the people who read poetry love poetry. So it's not as if I care, but maybe a book of poetry is going to sell, at least in the United States, a book of poetry is going to sell like maybe 500 or 600 copies, that's pretty good. I know there's some that sell more, of course, but compared to a novel that's selling 100,000 copies or something like that. Do you know what I mean? So whenever I write poetry, I want to please myself as an artist, first and foremost. I hope that I'm making something good. And then I do want people to like it, but mostly it's that I want to make something good. So I feel like I never had the pressure of wanting to please anybody other than myself. So I recently had some poems in Poetry magazine, and they're very dense little sonnets actually. And I was really excited about digging deep into English. So I dug down into the roots of English, into Middle English, not quite into Old English, but into Middle English, into Scottish, into French, and into Middle French and Middle Scottish, and into Norse, which was one of the tributaries that fed English. And then I brought it all the way up to contemporary vernacular slang. And I wanted these words to lie alongside each other in the poem. So I have these sort of Scottish words, these Norse words. Then I have like these contemporary slang, like I use the word swole, S-W-O-L-E, which is a contemporary slang word. And I just loved writing those sonnets. And somebody wrote on Facebook, he said, I didn't understand those poems. And what I wanted to say back was, nor did I. But I thought I didn't want to be flip, or rude to somebody who was commenting. So I didn't answer actually, and I'm not going to, but I think that's interesting, like the question of what one understands or how one encounters a piece of writing. And I think as a reader, I really love poems that are mysterious and poems that, I don't know, confuse me even, or present complicated visions of the world, both in their subject matter and in their language and form. So I think even when I write essays or when I write fiction, that attitude doesn't change necessarily. It's always been about writing the work for itself. So I really appreciate that. And even though I am now actually writing a novel for the popular market, I've been hired to write a choose your own adventure fantasy novel. So that is meant for the popular market. It's meant for the young adult fantasy novel. Yet even within the framework of that, I feel like I'm pushing as many boundaries as I can, both in terms of the characters as I've created them, and I'm trying to disturb gender roles as much as I can in this book. So it's like, it's always been about, for me, I've always lived at the edges myself as a human. And so as a writer too, I would rather be out there on the side with the freaks and the geeks, That's where I live.
Yeah. I think all of us kind of identify with that being on the outside, freak and sort of.
I mean, when you're a poet, you're just begging for people to take you seriously, So I feel like less in danger of compromising my vision in fiction because a poet is what I was first,
Right. So I actually want to bounce off of something you mentioned earlier where you were talking about, working in sonnet form and working with a lot of these kind of Western languages. Something though is that we are all, you know, from the South, we are from the South Asian diaspora, and so we all work within that history, and there's a really long history of poets in that area from, you know, of course now my brain just went blank, but verse is a part of our history. How do you bring those Eastern influences into your work? Do you bring those Eastern influences into your work?
Well, I do, and they come in, and I think that it's important to remember that, you know, after 400 years of colonization and post-coloniality and decolonization, that English is itself an Indian language, right? And that we are in the diaspora, like there's no authentic Indian. Even in national space, what people think of as authentic Indian is a modern invention, a response to the Mughal occupation. That's where this Hindustani identity came from. That's where the Hindu religion came from. That's where the Hindi language came from. You know, don't tell Modi, but it all came in response to the foreign. It was a way of asserting Indianness, right? There is no India in and of itself. There never was. Historically, there never was. It's a modern invention. It's 20th century, right? So I feel like those forms,
whatever,
1947, I feel like we have access to, you know, as global Indians, such as it is, I mean, we have access to all of that. We have access to the language if we know it or if we study it. We have access to the forms, to, you know, and I do think those forms are ancient. I mean, it's true that Hindustani, you know, to use that word in a cosmopolitan way, not in a national way, but let's say Desi, you know, like the subcontinental culture is ancient as the Greeks, and the literary forms and the philosophies, all of that I think soaks my work as much as the classical Greek does, you know. And there are poets like Agha Shahid Ali who kind of brought into, you know, very consciously brought into English the form of the ghazal, but there were others too. I mean, Ritika Vazrani is a poet who, she died very young, you know, so she didn't really have a chance to have too much of a strong impact on the landscape of American poetry. She died when she was 41, and she'd only published 2 books actually. But what she was actually doing, she was a student of yoga and she studied Sanskrit. And so she was actually doing poems in English that kind of relied on, she was using Sanskrit grammatical structures. So the word order was like very different. And she was doing really interesting things actually. So you can look at, in her first book is called White Elephants. She doesn't as much in that, but her second book is called World Hotel. And then there's a posthumous book that was done called Radha Says. And in both of those last 2, you can kind of see some of the experiments she was doing. So I think there's a lot of potential for us as post-colonial, diasporic, you know, with a hybrid culture. I think we have our pulse on a global society much more than anyone who falls back on some kind of false notion of essentialism, that there's actually something that you can say is quote unquote Indian, you know, or American for that matter, you know, like these are just, those words are fictions, you know, it's not real. When I say Hindustan, I mean like a geographical place.
Right.
There is a geographical place you can say that's Hindustan or Bharat or whatever word you want to use, but it's not a cultural identity, not really. I mean, it's a story that's being told, but you know,
yeah,
for political purposes.
Yeah.
Yes, I think that there's so much again to unpack, and I think that one thing that I think is really important as we start to dissect and disseminate space beyond this national concept is just to look at place, like the physical place, like where I'm staying right now at like King's Cross in Sydney, which reminds me so much of Juhu in Bombay, and it's like that is a real thing, that is a real space that I can draw recollection to. But the concept of Australia, the concept of India, the concept of US, these are all much bigger than any
narratives.
one
It's like they're
constituent place. So I really relate.
Yeah, they're political narratives. They're just stories that we're telling, and it so happens that a lot of people believe in the story, but it's just a story.
Yes, it is. And Michelle, how do you feel about these stories? Are there any ways that you in your writing also try to kind of just like make us think of these stories in a new way, or try to make us, or rather subvert our notions of how we can define ourselves in relation to these places?
Yeah, so no, it's really interesting to hear. It's refreshing and renewing to hear what Kazim says, because this story of the national story of India is so problematic for so many of us who are on the fringe, as I am with my people, my Anglo-Indian heritage, Eurasian heritage. It's so my father was Anglo-Indian and my mother was Goan. Yeah, it's been for me. When I first started writing, I spent childhood years in the UK, and then we migrated to Australia. And when I first started writing, I was writing as an Australian, and then I realised that after time that maybe that's how I see myself, right? I see myself as an Australian, South Asian origin, but I grew up in a pretty Anglophone way, as a sort of with that background of living in the West and not having language. So in Vishwarupa, the book that I wrote, that was my way of connecting with an imaginary identity that I felt that I'd been separated from as a result of colonization. And because I always grieved that deeply, that loss and I made several trips to India, stayed there, talked to people, read some Indian poets, and I also read some of the Vedanta and some sort of some philosophical writings, and I kind of used Sanskrit words in the book, but in a different way, in quite in a unique way. Like I used the diacritics were not 100% correct according to this particular transliteration, method that was used, but mainly because the publishers couldn't do that, and there was no one on the Australian side to actually embrace what I was doing, or in fact I was advised not to use any diacritics. I can just show you if I can just do a little. Yeah, so the diacritics, there should be a diacritic on the S, I believe, and they couldn't do that. So then after a while, I tried to be really, it's like at the back, there's a notes, it says, with modifications, I chose to use IAST, International Alphabet of Sanskrit, transliteration standards with diacritics for romanizing Sanskrit references. This is a reminder of differences between English and Devanagari phonetics. To acknowledge the syncretism of languages, the following notes accompany the poems. But yes, it was about syncretism, but it was also, in some ways, I thought, well, it's actually good because I'm actually making this a new word, one that you won't see online, in the many, many, many different ways of spelling the word Vishwarupa, right? So many ways of spelling it, many forms. And so I embraced that and I thought, yeah, this is my Anglo-Indian Vishwarupa or my Eurasian Vishwarupa, and I'm comfortable that even the idea of Anglo-Indian is problematic because of the racism of the British. They wanted that, they had a specific meaning for that, but actually my communities, my people, we call ourselves Anglo-Indians. So how does that figure, why is that whole story, that whole culture kind of erased out of the history? And a lot of the work that I'm doing in poetry and prose is to explore that. And I'm actually, look, I just want to say thank you so much for inviting me to this. It's so refreshing that I feel that I'm invited to this with a name like Cahill, and that I think that, that sort of, mindset of, the rampant sort of Hindu sort of stuff. It's not of our generation. It's of the past. And I think younger people, they're just pushing it aside. And I remember going to a conference in India. It was about 2009, I think. And this old elderly sort of scholar guy said to me, it's sort of, we were talking poetry, I can't remember, and I might have read one of the poems on Hanuman or something like that, and I was told I didn't pronounce it correctly, and then I was told, he said, well, you're not really Indian, are you? And afterwards I was pretty devastated, but afterwards one of the younger graduates just said to me, like, what you're saying is really interesting, because you're actually like, you're not of this, you're not living in this country, and you're writing in connection, and it's like a bridge. And so it was really exciting that I think the younger generation are eschewing that and turning away from that very that it is intolerant, isn't it? It's an intolerant national narrative that is actually writing out so many people's stories. And I also want to mention, like, the indigenous people of India, their stories as well, and the Dalit peoples, and the whole problem of the caste system. It's something that doesn't go away, and that violence, and also the violence against Muslims as well. This is something that is horrendous, and in allowing minority stories to have a place and a voice, we are upholding sort of a world that is much more tolerant and respectful. So thank you. I also want to acknowledge, while I'm on this topic,
I think
if I could just also acknowledge my great debt and thanks to Aboriginal people of Australia that have offered me a home, and all the many tribes, currently the Gurna people of South Australia and the Ngarrindjeri people. I'm currently on Kangaroo Island. It's not actually a place where Aboriginal people lived, because it was a mythic place for them, a place of the afterlife actually. But there are still many Aboriginal presences here, and I'm just so grateful to the custodians, past and present, for looking after this land and for allowing me a place to live here in this country. It means a lot to me. And our fight against racism is also their fight against colonialism and invasion and the violence of that.
Thank you so much, Michelle. I mean, that's something we really have to remember. And I think, incidentally enough, you've also linked into something else Kazim is doing in one of his other books, which is also to give kind of gratitude to a land that Kazim maybe can speak about this as well. He also ended up, well, I mean, maybe Kazim, would you like to talk a little bit about your experience also on Indigenous land? So I don't have to speak for you, but yeah, thank you.
This is the book this is the book that I was mentioning earlier, the memoir that's coming out in March. So I mean, all of us, we live on Indigenous land, and we can trace it. I live in Southern California, in the traditional lands of the Kumeyaay, people that lived from some 100 miles north of here all the way south into what is now Mexico. So the US-Mexico national border cuts across that traditional land. But I grew up in northern Canada. My father was an engineer. He's still alive. He's not an engineer anymore, but he was a hydroelectric engineer on a dam project in northern Canada that was building a dam that gave hydroelectric power to most of the province of Manitoba. And all of those dams in northern Canada are built on Indigenous land. So I grew up in a Manitoba Hydro Company town, but in the traditional territory of the Pimicikamak people, treaty land in Canada. I mean, it's their sovereign, Pimicikamak sovereign land, not in the national space of Canada. So but I never thought about it. I mean, we lived there for 3 or 4 years. I was a really young kid. I remember a little bit about it, but I was 4, 5, and 6, I think, probably, or maybe a little bit older than that, 5, 6, and 7. At any rate, only a couple of years. And then we left. And a while back, I was wanting to write about my childhood, and I wanted to write about growing up there in that forest in the middle of the Canadian wilderness, so-called wilderness. But as I was doing my research, what I really learned about was the impact of the dam on the indigenous community, the environmental and social and economic and cultural impact of the dam, and how it actually affected the mental health of the community. So I went back up there after 40 years. According to the local people, the local Pimicikamak people that I was talking to, I was the very first person who went back, who lived there, not from Manitoba Hydro. There's a Manitoba Hydro presence up there even now because they're running the dam, but from the town, who grew up in the town. So it was a very, very impactful visit. And that's kind of what the book is about. I was really thinking as an immigrant, as an Indian, South Asian immigrant. My parents moved first to England, then to Canada. As an Indian coming into, an immigrant coming into Canadian national space, and having access as an immigrant family, having more access to that Canadian national space than Indigenous people do, and benefit more from the government of Canada than the Indigenous people do. That was what I contended with in this book. So it's coming out in March. Hopefully everyone will check it out. It's called Northern Light, Power, Land, and the Memory of Water.
Yes, and I, as someone who's an advanced reader, I really enjoyed reading it as well. But I won't say any more because I want to avoid.
It's coming out in Canada and the United States right now. I'm trying to find publishers in other countries, but it's not.
I know.
Not yet.
I have to.
Yeah.
Yes, and I have to then later get back to you on something else, Kazim. We'll talk about that later.
We'll find an Australian publisher.
I know. I wrote an email, by the way, but I don't know if you ever got it. But
I'll check and see.
Yeah. Okay. Anyways, and now Michelle is here too, so we can all crisscross and cross-pollinate later, throw publishers at each other. But anyways.
Yeah.
But I do want, because we are, like, you two are fascinating, and I think we could like spend hours upon hours getting wisdom from you two, but sadly we cannot do that. I want to hear a little bit. Can either of you two, maybe, I think Michelle first, because I really would love to hear like just a short poem, like a line of a poem, or like some lines, because we don't have time for like many pages, but if you could do some short lines that really get at the heart of what you're trying to do and what you're trying to say from both of you, we'd really appreciate it. First, Michelle.
Okay, I'll read this because I think this is called Ode to Mumbai, and it's for Dilip Chitre after his Ode to Bombay. Have I read this for you, Kazim? I'm not sure. Anyway, I'll read it again. Sorry. Piece by piece, I'll remove your unwieldy syntax. I'll taste your jaggery as the street's kaleidoscope triggers a new explosion. I'll tear up draft after draft while you scorn my attempts to write an elegy or an epic. Not your first beggar or baladira, I too am engendered, colliding with hijras who float like dark moths weaving through Santa Cruz traffic. I'll find relief in each disappearance and hallucination. Discover your tableau of divas, slumdogs, fibs, and impresarios is a divine smokescreen or a hologram that easily bends into a new simile. But when held up to the light, I am only left with negatives. Mumbai. Even your name is a philologist's conundrum, as mine is the antithesis of myself, a colonial slip. Strip the layers, what remains are the bones, a different grammar for equivalent parts of speech, the same ivory teeth in any caste or creed. I hang in a gap between the sound and the meaning of words, dipping my subconscious in different time zones where my bed is a temple and a brothel, where dreams define me. Your poem has a history in which my pages are missing. I rise from the poem on a burning ladder of language.
Wonderful. That was amazing. Thank you, Michelle.
That was so good.
Yeah.
And it's so like evocative and pretty to like the imagery is so pretty.
Oh, thanks, Ishita. I am a little bit, yeah, like I can read you a more messy Mumbai poem if you like. Would you like to hear that?
I mean, I would, but then we're a little, yeah, okay, so it's short, however. Make it short though, because we're like, we don't have a lot of time left, but.
It's okay, well, let's hear from Kazim. I'd love to
Yeah,
hear from
yeah. No, we would love your poem, but this is what I'm saying. We have so much inside both of you, but we have to keep it within.
We have to keep this to an hour, but we could go for probably another 3.
Yeah, easily. Kazim, yeah, please.
I'll just read one little sonnet from the title poem of my book, The Voice of Sheila Chandra. The title poem is a series of 40 sonnets. So I'll just read you one little one of these. Okay. Calligraphy is a meeting point between abstract and particular. By certain combinations of visual marks to make symbols, Sheila Chandra lost her voice around the same time I found mine at midnight. We went to swim in the sea so we could be in the dark and not know the bottom. But the moon lit up the surface, so silver, so slam, and then the boy with the fear of failure, falling, architecture, voice, God, depths, death, he swam.
Again, wonderful, Kazim. Thank you. This is a really great poem. I mean, I've also read this book, and there's so many great poems in it, and I wish we could have the time to go into the depth and beauty of both of your poetry collections, because both are really special, and I'm really glad and honored that I got a chance to read them. So thank you both for letting me into your work. But
thank you.
I am dropping links to the
yes.
in our video, so
great.
Everybody who's watching, check out the comments if you want to buy these books.
Yeah.
And buy them from my bookstore because you want to support us.
But Michelle is in Australia, and I don't think you'll get books.
We have contemporary Asian Australian poets that she edited.
Cool. So. I have to send you some of my books, Ishita.
Yeah,
can I send you?
Absolutely, I would love that.
I'd love to send you some books.
All right, so let me look through, and we've got some audience questions. Anybody else in the audience that wants to drop questions in, we've got a few minutes for that. Emily Collier wants to ask Kazim. She said, the notion of writing to please yourself is such a great reminder. Does it get harder to do that as you get more successful or with a more public profile?
Okay, I think that's an amazing question, and I want to answer it, but with the caveat that I'm only answering for myself. I think that this has got to be different for every single person. And I think that there are probably artists out there with such integrity, personal integrity, that any level of success is not going to faze them at all. And they're just going to forge ahead and do their work, Bjork is a great example, or Yoko Ono, these people, they're so much themselves in their art, and Sheila Chandra for that matter. I am not one of those people. I desperately wanted approval. I'm a middle child. I desperately want attention. I want to be loved. I want to be the belle of every ball, And so it was challenging when my first book came out from Alice James. It got a fair bit of attention, actually. But my second book cured me of that a little bit. Sort of, nobody really cared about it. Then my third book, it was called Bright Felon. It was a experimental memoir, I guess. And once again, that brought me a little bit of, people were talking about me. It got reviewed a lot. I think for me, it was very dangerous as an artist, and I do think there's pressure to want to try to, create what people like. And I made a very, very real conscious decision after Bright Felon came out that I would turn away from that mode and like do something new with the next book. You know what I mean? And so at this point, and I went through, I want to be really honest with you. I might as well be, right? I went through a period where I felt very like, I don't know what, snubbed or something, where I felt like, well, why does my book not win any award, or why am I not more, you know, whatever it is, popular? I think every artist has these type of insecurities. And I did go through that, and I felt, you know, badly about that, but I never compromised in my work. I kept forging ahead. I was awfully stubborn, actually. And now I feel like personally I've come out the other end of that, and I see the benefit of, I mean, The Voice of Sheila Chandra is my 6th book of poetry, or maybe, I know it's my 7th book of poetry, actually. I've never won any kind of award. I've never gotten any of those, like, you know, accolades, nothing like that. Gosh, I applied for an NEA grant again this year, you know, for the, 20th time in my life, and didn't get it. So it's like, I think I feel okay now. I feel like I'm just doing my work. The people who find it are going to find it. It feels good. I like what I'm doing. I believe in it. I believe in it as an artist. I believe in it as a human. So I have nothing more to ask for, and there's nothing else I want.
That's one.
And I'm actually going to ask Michelle that same question: is it hard to kind of not compromise as you're, you know, trying to be successful?
I think I think that you publish your first book and in poetry, and it's kind of, as we've talked about, there's such a small readership, and it's kind of a little bit deflating. But you kind of like do a lot of readings and you make it work, and it's amazing how people get to know about your work. And I did a bit of traveling as well, going to conferences. I think pretty much I followed the pathway of just what I wanted to do in terms of exploring sometimes research interests. I had to teach myself about my own identity because there was no one to really teach me. It was such a mixed ancestry, kind of so exiled from the national story. I had to kind of learn myself and find my own archives and stuff, and find out all the archival erasures, and learn from some of the people who'd written on this, and also, you know, exploring different types of tropes in fiction, poetry, and so forth. That I followed that path, and that path has led me, and also the path of language as well, in terms of what I mean by that is in terms of step by step getting to better skills with language in poetry. And I learned a lot just by trial and error in fiction, having things, you know, which didn't work and which I had to do a lot of work on. And even the process of even writing a novel or a short story, it's a huge process. And just through these I think have been the things that have taken me along a pathway, and so I don't regret it, because I feel the sense of accomplishment. I know what I've achieved, and it's so important for me with the current work that I'm doing is to have it right. In some ways it's easy to get published in a way. Of course not, you know, you're always looking for that book contract, but you know what I mean. It's kind of, you can get published, right? But you can't take it back once it's published. So for me, the process is always to be really happy with what I've putting out there, and I'm really feeling that I know that I have taken a journey, and it's taken me to a place of understanding, in a place that I'm really comfortable with, and that place is language. And I'm really, you know, and I know a little more about history of my people, and I can express that in language. I can talk about my people, and that's really important to me. And I know that that's a huge achievement when there isn't the support there, you don't belong to a particular, you know, you're so in the sort of liminal zone. So I'm comfortable with what I'm doing, and it's a blessing to be a writer. It's a gift to be, you know, although not when you're destroying yourself writing a book, it doesn't feel that way. But it's like Kazim, I just feel like I wouldn't change things, and it's beautiful. It's a privilege to be able to live the way that I truly want to, which I think a lot of people live with ambitions to pursue things which they don't. And I'm really glad that I've been able to. That makes sense. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Of course, you always feel like,
can I add one thing? Can I add one thing quickly about publishing? Because you mentioned about publishing your work. I've always worked with small and independent presses, and I feel like so passionately about that. And I think maybe that is one reason why, I mean, obviously, if you work with a Random House or whoever it is, a big multinational, it gives you certain benefits. But the editors that I've worked with, the people who work for these presses, the passion that they have for literature, the type of work that they publish, the risks that they're willing to take, I will always stand by and stick with the small and independent press. You know,
we love small indie presses.
Yeah, I've given my career
all fans of small indie presses.
Yeah, I've given my career to them, and I think it's made all the difference for me as an artist, as a person writing these books too, because I know I don't have to sell it to anybody.
Yeah. And I do have one final question to kind of wrap things up before we get going. As you guys know, I work in a bookstore. And oftentimes one thing I hear from customers coming in is, oh, I want to get into poetry, but I almost feel intimidated by the genre. What would you say to those people, and kind of how to get into it and how to, you know, look at it and understand it when they're, you know, so much of it out there in so many different forms?
Well, I would say that go for it. If you love it, go for it, because you know what, there are so many different types of poets getting published now, and you know, and they've got so many different voices, and there's a market for all a range, you know, even so, you know, in fact, the traditional lyric is kind of really under pressure in some ways. So like the conventional lyric, you know, yeah, I mean, just go for it, because, you know, it is about, I think there's a lot of poems now that are being published which are about performance as well. I mean, it's really valid, and it's a really beautiful form. So, you know, and there are also different ways of publishing. Like I've recently been working with the Red Room Poetry organization, and they have published a sequence of my poems online with videos as well. And, you know, it's really nice not to be pushing that towards a book. So there's different forms of publishing.
Yeah, for sure. Kazim?
I just want to say, I think I second what Michelle said. I think it is really like, it's a form of devotion. I think it's a form of practice of entering and not knowing what the result is going to be. In the old yogic texts, of course, this is the goal of yoga, is to act without karma, without attachment to outcome, right? You do what you do because of itself. You do it for itself. And so I think with life, I think life should be like that, and I think writing should be like that too.
Great.
The beautiful point, Kazim. Thank you so much. I just wanted to ask if, because Muhammad Umar in the live stream has asked to hear Michelle's poem. Like, do you think that would be a good place to close if we do hear your messy poem, Michelle? Are you all right with that, Kazim? Or?
Of course.
Yeah, because I'm also now curious. So maybe we'll close on that, and hopefully it can be like a nice conclusion piece as well to what's actually been extremely insightful and beautiful recording. Thank you. We're going to make a recording of this as well, so everyone who couldn't come could see it there. So
thanks so much. It's been a real pleasure to have this conversation and to share my work with you, Kazim. Yeah, thanks, Karim and Ishita. Mumbai by night for Charlene. After I sent you the text and there was silence, it occurred to me it felt like a wave about to break. Last time I heard your voice startle, hesitant, as though you guessed I could drown in that suite that upgraded me into because cocaine addicts were flipping, trashing the next room. I was so high, you knew our drinks were spiked. I was so high, you knew our drinks were spiked with ice that I'd switch amnesia for insomnia. No wake up, please. But soon enough, the Mumbai dawn would flood the glazed facades of the 30-something floor, a miasma of smog over the Dharavi slums, the Marshall development, the India Bulls and Oberoi towers, that I'd catch my flight all the way back to oblivion until the next stopover. Assuming your Bollywood diva permits, we'll take a ride to Tryst in Lower Parel. We'll smoke in the heat of a taxi, windows down, talk boys, and dance to the electro house screen as overweight brokers and expatriates admire. Or else we'll drink tequila, eat takeaway with your old man, avoiding awkward questions while filling in the gaps for what little we know of each other. Let's face it, however easygoing you seem, like any foreigner you're obliged to entertain, one who has finally acquired the sense to keep her opinions unpacked. We may never wake in the same room again, unsure if I should go to Goa with you or chance a rebel poet in Chhattisgarh. I guess the disparity between my intensity, jet lag, and your street glamour won't ever change. Time is fixed currency without counterfeit, so brief it leaves me cheating myself with words.
Wow, thank you again, Michelle. And now I'm getting a little greedy for poetry, to be honest.
Poetry? More
I
poetry.
really am. No, because you both are excellent poets, so it's like really frustrating. I really wish we could just do this for hours and hours and just wait for random people to come into our live session when they feel like it. But okay, Kazim, can you do a short poem as well? I know I didn't ask. No one asked, but I asked. So please just do a short poem for us too.
Okay, this is a poem called Recite. Small animal, recite. You sent nowhere, arriving in the night. All my forgotten prayers. Not prayers, really. Nothing to ask for. No one would answer. Crassness of calling a body, a corpse. The lawnmower sound through the window. The housekeeper singing. Is this body a house? Is this house a body? God is like you, a misfit. You don't fit, he don't fit.
Wow. Now that is the perfect poem to end on, to be honest. Like that is like literally, I know. It's also everything what Sambashana is about, not fitting in, but making space for it despite it. So I love that. I love that we're all misfits. I love that we're all hooligans. I love that we don't fully fit into the comportments of like what human nature is meant to tell us to, or rather we do and do what human nature tells us to be. We happily act as though we must. And I'm very honored to have all of you in the room, and thank you so much for this. I know everyone who came really loved this, and we will look forward to hopefully continuing to remain in touch and dialogue. As
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
It was great to chat with you, Michelle and Ishita. And
Really beautiful to talk to you. It was a real honor to talk to you, Kazim, and thank you so much, Kiran and Ishita.
Yes. Kazim, where can people find you on the internet if they want to keep up with your work?
I am at kazimali.com, or you can find me on Twitter at Kazim Ali Poet.
And Michelle?
So you can follow me on Twitter at The Herring Lass, and I have a website as well, so check that out, www.michellecarl.com. It's got links to my books.
Awesome. And then, of course, if you're here for Sambashana, you can follow us on Facebook, like this page. And this is our last event for 2020, but we'll have more coming up next year.
Yes, we're really looking forward to next year. We're going to have Umar Timol and Malachi Edwards talk about. Malachi is from Malaysia, Umar is from Mauritius, and we're going to be talking about what it means to create community, like out of two countries that usually we do not hear from in the West, in the greater global English-speaking world. So we're really excited to talk to them about their process as well.
So keep an eye out for that in January 2021.
Yes.
All right. Thank you guys again, and we will see you next time on Sambashana. Have a good night, morning, afternoon, wherever you are.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Bye.